president of RespectAbility, and we're a brand new organization that's working to help empower people with disabilities to achieve the American dream. There are some really important leaders in this room who've been working at these issues a lot longer than us, and we benefit from learning from them on disability issues. But our contribution sort of to this effort is strategic communications. So our very first speaker at our very first event, I'm very happy to introduce my friend Lanny Davis. Is an extraordinary communicator himself personally, but he is also exceptionally sage in terms of the advice that he gives to people when they're in crisis mode. He worked for the Clinton White House. He went to law school with Hillary Clinton. He's represented all kinds of different people in crisis moments. I had the distinct moment and opportunity to work with him in the Middle East on some terrorism issues that were very acute. When we were in a crisis communication situation, when we did a daily, I think it was 5 a.m. every single day conference call where we were putting out talking points to communicators globally on some terrorism issues, and it was a great honor and pleasure to work with him and also to travel with him to the Middle East to meet with heads of state. So Lanny is an extraordinary leader, extraordinary communicator. He's got a new book out, which I suggest you all get and read. Lanny Davis, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you. So I don't know if you want me to stand or sit. What do you prefer? I'll stand and see if I wear out. It was a very late night last night. First of all people to be praising somebody else about communication skills and crisis skills is Jennifer Mizrahi, one of the great, in my opinion, political and media and communication strategists in, may I use the expression, this town. I don't know if you've read that book yet. I actually was very appreciative of the first review of Mark Leibovitz's book, who I know very well. Of course, as soon as I saw the article, I saw the very convenient index that somebody else had compiled because he wouldn't allow the Washington read, which is you go right to the index. And so I went there and was relieved that I was not in that book. Back to Jennifer and why I'm here. Jennifer has had the capacity over the years, whether it's in the Democratic Party or whether it's in very, very far-reaching issues in the Middle East, and now with the disability community, to make things happen, to bring people together. As I said to Jennifer before I began this conversation, I said to my wife last night, just imagine walking into a room where there's nothing happening, and a person walks in, and by the time the person walks out, everybody is energized, focused, and there's a strategy, and then somehow an organization grows and develops, and the world changes for the better. And that's really my truthful assessment of Jennifer. She's also very kind to me and omits some of the pain and agony that I caused her at 5 o'clock in the morning. Because I was talking to a group of people who were, was it 7 hours or 8 hours ahead in Israel? And there were some mornings where I was at my best at 5 o'clock in the morning. Those weren't many mornings. And there were some mornings I was at my worst. I was very intemperate, impatient, sometimes raised my voice. So with some embarrassment, I say, despite all that, Jennifer still has the kindness to say a few good words about me. And what I'm here to talk about today is basically what I've learned over the years, and some of this I've learned from Jennifer, a friend of ours, Frank Luntz, who is on the other side of the aisle, but is an expert at what I want to talk about, and that is in the disability community, as in every other community that is looking for recognition, certainly looking for help from government at times, but at times doesn't want help from government, wants respect and dignity more than help from government. And especially wants the public to be aware, to be informed about people with certain types of disabilities, to understand what their needs are, and to especially understand when government is needed and when government needs to stay out. And both of those needs need to be communicated better to the inside circle of influence, which is where we are right here. If you're in politics, you know about the theory of concentric circles. You start out in a campaign with the narrowest concentric circle, 5 people, and then you start using multiplier geometry, 5 times 5 times 5. And the circles get wider and wider from the circle. I always call myself the inside circle junkie, meaning I do not count. My opinions are completely aberrational. I'm a junkie. I read, I live politics. I'm not normal. When a pollster asks me a question, I say, don't listen to me. I'm really very abnormal. But the inner circle, the activists, the people like yourselves that are educated and energized and informed, have a long way to go to get to that outer circle. One circle at a time is less and less informed and less motivated. So even here on Capitol Hill, where you have staff people who are responsible for legislation that affects the disability community, it's shocking and can be discouraging how uninformed even the inner circle people are. And of course, the more you get to people who have families and children and relatives who are people with disabilities, you get more information, more education. But still, the absence of full information is pretty clear. And of course, when you get to the outer circle, the average person, the amount of ignorance and misunderstanding is pretty substantial. I'm probably close to the outer circle in terms of my education on disability issues. I'm hoping through Jennifer, the way she got me very educated about Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas and terrorism in a way that I thought I understood until I actually went to Israel with Jennifer. I realized how totally ignorant I was. I feel that way about speaking to all of you. I'd like to learn a lot more what your priorities are, what your organizations are focusing on. But for today, in my opening comments, I really wanted to talk not about crisis management. I would urge you to read my book. It's a great book. I'll just tell you in one sentence, the book starts with Martha Stewart calling me in the middle of the night saying, I hate my blankety blank lawyers, can you help me? And that blankety blank was the F-bomb, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife overheard a female voice saying, I hate my blankety blank lawyers. And she said, is that really Martha Stewart? And then the last chapter, which is the one that was the most difficult one to write and most moving for me, was when I got called into Penn State by the new president of Penn State University after Coach Paterno had been fired. And the uproar throughout the Penn State community was not about children being raped, and it wasn't about 10 years of silence after the knowledge was definitely there. It was about the firing of Coach Paterno. And I had to figure out a way to deal with people who were very emotional about loving this very great man who made very poor choices. And how to convey that message is really why I want to segue back to all of you. So messages and words, whether it was my trying to figure out how to talk to people who are true believers in Joe Paterno and remind them this is about the children and about 10 years of silence while children were being raped on Penn State campus without offending all the alumni who love Joe Paterno. How do you do that? Well, words matter, and sensitivity and understanding of what the other person is thinking and being able to be receptive to another viewpoint without attacking it. Very, very important sentence for me in my life, which my father taught me from To Kill a Mockingbird. And now that I have a second family, I have 2 older children and 6 grandchildren. And I have 2 sons, 15 and 8. Now that's a crisis management. And I am in my second marriage if you try to figure that age. But I read this sentence to my son, who's now in the 9th grade, and read To Kill a Mockingbird when he was in the 8th grade, which I thought was great. I read it in high school, they're reading it now in elementary school. The sentence was about, I remember Atticus Finch, the lawyer in To Kill a Mockingbird, is listening to his daughter be very, very angry. It happened to be about a white kid who was from a very low-income family, and Scout was very angry with him and judging him. And Atticus said, and it was actually said once in the page 14, and then at the end of the book, in a slightly different formulation. You have to walk in other people's shoes, and the second formulation is be in their skin, either way, and look at the world through their eyes. So when you are communicating here on the Hill, whether it's Republican or Democrat, you might assume a Democrat might be more sympathetic to federal funding, because Democrats tend to be more sympathetic to government, and Republicans are more hostile to federal funding of very great needs in the disability community. But being able to communicate with both of those viewpoints means following the lesson that Atticus was trying to teach his daughter, which is rather than arguing and winning the argument, try to have a conversation using the language that the other person's perspective will be most receptive to. All politicians do that who are successful instinctively. The one that I know for 40 years is one of the best of anyone I've ever seen is President Clinton, who doesn't change his position on issues, but depending on the audience, his language, his cadence, his whole body language changes as he's judging what is being received well and what isn't. So in your experience, developing a communications strategy to get public attention on the particular needs of whatever disability your organization focuses on, or the very great work that Jennifer is trying to do is to bring everybody together and to have a focused strategy no matter what the disability that's being discussed or focused on. Having a strategy of the right words to choose, the right message, and especially listening for a good part of your meetings when you're lobbying, when you're advocating, a lot more than talking. A piece of advice that my family always tells me I should follow more than giving the advice is to listen better. But I do find in a meeting where I'm developing a crisis strategy, a communication strategy, a lobbying strategy, it's all the same thing. It's how to persuade, how to open a mind to your viewpoint. And I think that there is very important advantage that you have, because there should be sympathy and support for any family that has special needs, whether it's defined as a disability or a special need. I need better information to know how you all, what vocabulary you use to differentiate different needs. But it is very important to have a strategy and to be persistent. And then finally, how to get your message out. And that's sort of my final topic. It's one thing to say it right. It's another thing to have someone like Jennifer organizing and getting focused energies and focused messages. But it's still the tree falling in the forest. With all your effort, who's listening? How do you get the mass media to pay attention? When I mean mass, I mean the outer circle that I talked about, to know what you're talking about. And there's only one way, and that's through the media. You don't have money to do paid advertising. So you have to learn to use media. In my ancient days, my 15-year-old son, when he's nice to me, calls me a dinosaur. When he's not being nice, he calls me Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is a mean dinosaur, a flesh-eating dinosaur. But the most important thing of all in getting a message out is to use social media, and this generation depends heavily on the smartphone and social media to communicate. But I still believe in the power of old-fashioned media. And if you don't believe me that television, as old-fashioned as you can get, is still the most powerful way to reach people, just look at the budgets of every political campaign and see where most of the money is being spent. It's not being spent on social media or Facebook or targeted ads from Google data. It's being spent on very expensive, very inefficient, because a lot of your money is being spent among people who aren't watching television. But people who are watching get a very, very strong impact. And so since in your organizations, paid media is out of the question, I'm sure, free media, you have advantages. It's the technique of how to pitch stories, who to call, how to develop relationships with reporters. This lady is the expert of any expert that I know. In fact, I won't mention specific organizations, but one of the great quick slogans that Jennifer said to me, the difference between the organization that Jennifer founded, the Israel Project, and another organization whose name I won't mention, both of the organizations trying to get the facts out, trying to get truth and have a conversation that was truthful. So when Jennifer asked me to help, and I asked her, well, why don't we call this reporter and scold or criticize the reporter for not getting the facts right. Jennifer said, you gotta understand, we pitch, not bitch.
Exactly.
And I got it. If you pitch, you're winning an open mind. If you bitch, the mind is closing and you're just getting somebody angry. So with that as my closer, and to summarize, communication, words, putting yourself in other people's skins and perspectives to try to get them to understand what the disability community is about, what your needs are. Try to go into their perception that maybe they think you want too much government, maybe they think you want special help as opposed to other people. Put yourself in their perspective and then find a way to communicate. I think you have a very strong case to make. And I think the mass media, free television, and strategy of getting into the mass media as well as using the social media is a must, or it's unfortunately a very, very good cause with a tree falling in the forest that nobody hears. So thank you. I would love to take your questions. Yes?
What do you think about developing focus groups, and what competencies would you utilize in developing focus groups, and how much credence would you give to the outcomes of what focus groups say?
Well, a great deal of credence depending on how they're conducted, but don't ever assume that you're seeing data that represents a cross-section of the population.
That's what a lot of focus group developers try to say, that they're
And the good ones will always warn, this is not a sample of the population, it's an atypical, can't say a certain percentage of this room represents the population. But this is about the point I was making about putting yourself in other people's skins and listening, is that from focus groups you can learn so much about your own message and what's working and what isn't working. It's not going to give you definitive answers, but it gives you guidance. And some of the best moderators of focus groups, and Jennifer is an expert at using focus groups properly. It's absolutely fundamental to any message strategy.
Other questions? Yes.
Seen a little bit of
Can you say who you're from and what your name
Paul
is?
Tobin with United Spinal Association.
United what?
United Spinal Association.
Thank you.
President Obama had Kareem Dale, a special advisor to him, and that office has since been vacated, moved on. And it doesn't seem that the administration is actively seeking a replacement. In fact, they seem to have decided that they're not going to have a special advisor.
It started yesterday.
Never mind.
So, yes, there is a replacement.
Claudia Gordon started yesterday.
And is she's there, the special advisor, or is she tasked with this on top of other duties?
No, that's her dedicated duty at external relations.
Right.
Does she have a disability?
Yes.
She's got-
She comes from.
So you see how easy we get things done in Washington? You
You only have to ask.
ask the question, you get the answer. Yes,
Yes, sir.
Sorry.
yes, sir.
Tony Stevens with National Interest for the Blind. I like the kind of what you mentioned about the pitch, don't bitch. And it made me think of a Van Jones quote where Dr. King says, "I have a dream, not a complaint." I'm curious to know though, with so much of the organizations in this room and the issues we deal with, where it's hard not to complain when you find yourself so far out on the margins, what, any sense or direction you can have on where there's an immediacy for happening to that sense of, look, you gotta scream or else no one will hear you, but still trying to stay positive, trying to stay focused, trying to find the light at the end of the tunnel, or whatever you call it. So.
Well, it's sure easy on this question, great question. It's sure easy for me to give advice and not be able to take it. So I'm not a great patient person. My family would not put the word patient next to my name very easily. And especially impatient, we just were having a conversation about my experience with the Department of Education, lobbying on an issue and getting frustrated that facts didn't seem to matter. No matter what facts I mentioned in a lobbying visit, the ideology would just trump whatever I would say that were facts. And in your situation, it's very frustrating if you're seen as just asking for help as opposed to addressing needs that would help society if they were addressed, helps the workplace, helps families, helps so much about the rest of us who are lucky enough not to have disabilities or special needs. It's just real frustrating not to get angry and pound the table and say, listen, for goodness sakes, you don't get it, which is some of the things I used to say when I was frustrated in lobbying. Listen to me. So I guess it's a matter of learning what works. Every human being will have the weak moments where you get frustrated and where you just want to pound the table. It's going to happen. But when over a period of time you do lobbying, especially, may I show a little ideological bias. I mean, some of my best friends are Republicans, and I write a column every week called Purple Nation, where I'm trying to get Democrats and Republicans to walk in each other's shoes. But I get real frustrated sometimes when a Republican will say to me, well, you're just looking for a federal subsidy, just another handout. And I will sometimes be weak and go right back at, well, you don't mind all the subsidies for the big corporations, but you don't want to help people who are poor or people who are in need. So this is a private enterprise for the poor, but socialism for the rich. And that doesn't get me anywhere, but it sure feels good when I say it. So just try to resist and lower your tone and try to find a spot in the other person's vocabulary that they're going to respond to. That's the secret. That's why I told you the Atticus Finch story.
Melissa and then Anil.
Okay, Anil can go first. I'll go last.
No,
Ladies first, I'm so dumb.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's my friend, he knows. No. First of all, I'll out myself as a Republican.
Oh, good.
And, but I'm not, I grew up, my very first job on the Hill was in a Democrat from Tennessee's office, so I've worked with both sides of the aisle. And I just, want to say that you're completely hitting on all the cylinders, and as a person with a disability, I totally appreciate that.
Okay.
One of the things that I run into in lobbying on either side of the aisle, and even having relational conversations, is that people think they understand because they've looked at things. But something I've found to be really effective is to create experiences when people are in the situation, because you don't know until you're in the situation. And I mean, I know it in my own family because my sister thought that I was the biggest wimp going until she broke her femur in 6 places after being stepped on by a thoroughbred. And she called me after 3 days on morphine and used several expletives and said, how do you do this? And you can put the expletives in there. And I said, how much morphine do they have you on? Yeah, because it was, it took the experience. What are your thoughts on how do we create, I know how I would do it, but I want to know your thoughts on how do we create that experiential understanding?
Well, that's a great question, and it gets to an insight that I think is the best communication tool that you can have, and that's personal anecdotes. If you can get somebody to get beyond the argument, either ideological or philosophical, whatever the argument is, where there's a back and forth sensation in the room, and just tell a personal story, either about yourself or somebody else. There is a universal, a common link to personal anecdotes, and especially if it's one that the other person can identify with. And I've done my share of lobbying where I got nowhere until I started to get personal. You know, I have a family with 6 grandchildren and 2 young kids. What's your family like? And you start to find linkages and personal anecdotes about maybe an experience with your disability like you just told me. While you were telling me that story, was it your sister? I was imagining what your sister was like. You said morphine.
She's great. She's awesome, but she's just, I'm the baby, and she's the oldest, and they're just the 2 of us, so you have that whole
But you
dynamic.
connected with me by just
Yeah.
getting a personal anecdote. When you said morphine, all I could think of was when I was in the hospital, that I looked at morphine. Please give me more. But it's the personal anecdote that conveys your message is a very, very effective way of communicating, especially on the Hill.
And I'll close with this. Junkies rock, because I is one, so you've got to read, that's how you learn.
Get a life, stop being so political, Mike.
You get a life too. If I can get a life, you can get a life. We can do this.
I'll do it. Yes, sir.
Daniel Lewis, National Federation of the Blind.
Yes.
I appreciate your comments. You said something that struck a chord with me, and I want to know if you have a success story or a strategy that's used in the past. You talked about how ideology sometimes trumps the facts. So no matter how much the data proves that your argument is correct, the pre-existing ideology about disability, the whole custodialistic value system around people with disabilities, is pervasive in the room before we even get there. So how do we show that the facts really dispel the myths, the stereotypes, the sociological myths around disability? And your example doesn't have to be a disability example, but if you can show how, when you walked into the room, the ideology of the person you're talking to trumps all the data that you have, all the facts that you have to share. What do you use to combat that?
Well, again,
Before you answer, can I just invite people to take seats, because there's seats in the front, so please be comfortable.
unless you prefer to stand. Again, a great question, and my mixed experience in succeeding really goes back to what you provoked in me, which is the more personal and anecdotal and off. My friend Hillary Clinton, when her last name was Rodham, we used to sit around having conversations about what we wanted to do when we grew up. I always knew she would run for president someday, even the first week I met her. But the notion that facts didn't matter and that that wasn't the way public policy would be determined was totally unthinkable. When you talk to law students who are trained on focusing on the facts and applying the law to the facts. So I'm afraid to say that it's really not the best method at the outset. You've got to find a human link to open a mind, or else the ideology and the philosophy will trump. I was talking about my experience representing for-profit colleges. Now, I'm a liberal Democrat, proudly, unapologetically, back from Franklin Roosevelt. My father thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I'm representing a segment that's educating kids using federal funds for profit. Those are all hot ideological words that I would have negative reactions to as an automatic liberal Democrat. And then I got into the facts and started to get very frustrated and came up here and talked to my fellow liberal Democrats. Well, for-profit must mean they're evil, they're gouging, they're taking advantage. And I would say, but wait a minute. The non-for-profit kids, these are lower income kids. These are kids with special needs who go to these career colleges because they can't get into Yale and Harvard and can't afford to. The community college kids are supported by tax dollars, I would say. Their default rate on federal loans is the same as at for-profits or higher. And they're subsidized by taxpayers as opposed to shareholders. But I couldn't get to first base and I was frustrated until I realized that this is about kids. And I brought some, and started to bring some for-profit kids who had graduated and gotten a trade and a degree and went on to a successful life after education that they got because they were able to do a daytime job and do a career college at night. So in the disability community, it just seems to me there's got to be a personal connection If it's an ideologue that doesn't believe in federal programs and doesn't believe in serving people with special needs, then talk family and see where there's a connection. You'll find one, and forget the facts. And as I said to my friend in the back who asked me the question, it's easier to give advice than to take advice. This is the most difficult of all advice to take, because it is frustrating if the person you're talking to doesn't care about the facts, or even worse, has a misunderstanding of the facts that won't be corrected about what it's like for you or for the disability community, and won't even listen because their minds have closed. Not everything is possible. Sometimes you just have to give up and move on to the next person. But I'm pretty stubborn about trying to look for some kind of a human link. That's the reason I started my column on Purple Nation. I just figured there even conservative Republicans have good ideas once in a while.
Yes.
Are there questions from new people
Thank you.
before we go to people who already asked questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
you're next.
when, I mean, the disability community, of course, does not all march in lockstep, and there are a variety of views in the disability community, just like there are in a variety of interest groups. In my experience, one of the most difficult situations to overcome is when there are disagreements within the particular advocacy community, because the policymakers and the decision makers are then getting different views, conflicting views, contradictory and contrary views, and in many instances they don't know what to make of it, or they will use the disagreement amongst the advocates to decide not to do anything or to go in a particular direction that's not particularly fruitful. What do you recommend when you have a situation where your fellow advocates may not necessarily be thinking alike, and there can be a hodgepodge of
Well, lobbying and media are very similar. You have to boil everything down to a headline and come together on a common message. That's a lot easier than wrestling with the options and the solutions, where you'll have some disagreements among people of the same mind. We'll have disagreements on what to do to solve a problem. So when I'm in a large coalition of people and we have a lobbying objective, or when I'm talking to a reporter trying to pitch a story, I try to boil it all down to a few words. One of my 5 rules in my book about crisis management is keep the message simple, boil it all down. So if there is disagreement within a community, it can often be heartfelt. It's often, unfortunately, more bitter than when you're disagreeing with somebody of the opposite persuasion. But one way of overcoming that is focus on your core message that you'll probably be able to agree on. And agree when you go into lobby that you're going to stick to that core message and make sure the person you're lobbying understands the core message. And then when it comes time to, well, what do we now do? What's your solutions? I don't mind having a discussion about different options where people in the room are saying, what about this, what about that? That's different than arguing in front of somebody. So that doesn't disturb me as much, but I think you do have to have the discipline of boiling your message down to a few words, because you have 30-second attention spans, whether it's a reporter, a politician, or a staffer, and you got to get that quick core message through the first couple of minutes of your meeting. Yes?
Kristen McKiernan with the ARC.
Hi.
Often I struggle with the push and pull between getting us in a fast-moving news story versus maintaining our credibility. And I'll give you an example. A few months ago, there were those women who were found after years of captivity in Ohio. That man who was keeping them locked up. There were rumors that one of the women had an intellectual disability. That wasn't really ever confirmed. And so it was a situation where there was a story not being told, that there was a young woman who potentially had an intellectual disability. She was that made her vulnerable to a monster like this man, but we could not confirm that. And so we decided to not pitch that angle of the story because we couldn't confirm. I thought, our credibility could be hurt if we were to step out and make that claim and not really know for sure. So can you talk a little bit about a situation like that or others where you know, you're trying to juggle two objectives. One is make sure the story is told, but also protect your organization's credibility.
Can you add on the boy with Down syndrome who was killed in the same?
Yes, the recent story about the boy in Massachusetts.
Actually, Maryland.
Frederick, Maryland, right north of where I live. So the fact that he had Down syndrome was not a prominent part of the story. It took a lot of reading. Jennifer forwarded it to me, and I actually said, "Oh, I think I've read about that, but I didn't realize." So I think that's a very important fact to get out. It might change the whole direction of the story. But you were right in your decision. It's hard because the culture of the internet and the blogosphere is to post first and check second. And I keep shamelessly plugging my book, but I went through an experience myself where I was the victim of a posting that accused me of writing a column that did not disclose that I had a client with an interest in the column's subject matter. It was posted and widely distributed, went viral, because that's unethical. If I ever did that, I should not be allowed to write a column. I called the person that posted it, and I said, "You know, you never called me. Why didn't you call me? It's absolutely untrue. I do not represent anyone. And indeed, I've written about this subject many times." "Oh, I was going to call you, so I'll do an update."
Yeah, that's all you need.
I will do an update. So you made the right decision, but it's also contrary to my advice, which is get in the news cycle right away or you lose the window. But I think ultimately, truth is much more important to protect, and your credibility is more important to protect than getting into the first news cycle.
In the back? Yes.
Hi, Chuck Graham with the ADA Center in Columbia, Missouri.
Hi, John.
How do we become part of the American conversation? If you take a look at disability, people with disabilities or disability issues, they'll talk about LGBT issues, women's issues, Hispanic issues, go on down the line. But they never talk about people with disabilities, disability issues, and there wasn't a single question in all of the presidential debates last cycle about people with disabilities or a single disability issue, yet we're 57 million Americans. How do we become a part of it?
So that'll be the last question. That's a big one.
I think the people in this room and this new organization organize, 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 concentrate, 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 laser beam your lobbying energies in an umbrella organization that then gets you into the media and never stops trying. So it's not easy, but you can't do it one organization at a time. And I'm really singing Jennifer's praises, and she'll probably be angry with me that I'm overdoing it. But the fact is, she gets it, and few people in this town do, that you've got to have message and facts, and you have to have credibility, and with a wherewithal about how to translate focus groups into an easy-to-understand message. But ultimately, you have to have the power of a lot of forces focused like a laser beam. And you can't do that without organizing, one step at a time. All right, final question.
One final question. You played right into it. One of the things that I have, that I find really, really interesting on both sides of the aisle is that people who don't either A, have experiential knowledge of a subject or a true understanding of the subject, because you have to experience. You don't know what it is to have a child with a disability until you become the parent of a child with a disability. You don't know what it is to teach a child with a disability until you teach a child with a disability. You don't know what it is to live with a disability until you've lived in the skin of someone who's disabled. Wouldn't you say that it goes past the message to the messenger?
Yes.
You've got to have the correct messenger out there.
Yes.
Because I mean, I'm in the Clinton Gore, in the first Clinton Gore race. My first job on the Senate side was with Al Gore, and Tipper Gore is awesome. And I noticed, I mean, as soon as Hillary started upsetting people, which I think she's awesome. I think she's awesome. But when she was not playing well, they put Tipper out, and all of a sudden the message started. I mean, that's when they started to turn the tide. Is when they got the right messenger out there. And how would you suggest finding and putting out the right messenger?
I think it's back to the insight you and I shared with everyone as I listened to you, which is get down to personal, anecdotal, human case studies. Let people see, hear, understand, appreciate what it feels like, what daily routines are like, what life is like within a family with somebody with special needs. It's not that you're looking for sympathy or empathy, but that will happen. But the more personal and anecdotal you get, the more receptive the ears become, as opposed to factual arguments and political arguments. So I think that's the best close of wishing you all the best of luck, and I will be, I never say no to Jennifer, even when I want to. So if she calls me to help you in any way, I would certainly like to write a column, which I have this great privilege of writing this column once a week. Nobody pays me, it's pure pleasure. People say, why do you do it? And I say, it's the one time I have for myself doing what I enjoy. Why not? I would love to write about this organization and see what happens. Thank you all.
He is amazing. He is, as I said, a national treasure.